I'm new to Canadian politics actually, and when I joined CJPME, I'm more like, I mean, you'd be aware of what's happening based on the news, but now I follow it more closely. And I can confidently say that their policies are pro-Israeli through and through. There is no glimmer of any indication that, despite what they want to advertise about themselves. But I know that you are pretty experienced with Canadian politics. You ran for the Green Party, and you have been involved for most of your life. From the beginning of the genocide, do you sense or feel or think that Canada's policies towards Israel changed in any way?
Not one iota. Not
Yeah.
one iota. And I want to highlight the fact that by historical standards, and I'm talking, when I say historical, I mean by Canadian political history standards, the situation right now in Canada should be, in theory, particularly favorable for the Palestinian cause. And the reason for that, for all of the post-World War II history, we've either had liberal governments or conservative governments. Now we have something that's very unusual. We have a liberal minority government that is propped up by the NDP, which is supposed to be a left-wing party that is sympathetic to the cause of the Palestinian people. And I certainly know that's true at a grassroots level. The grassroots of the NDP is highly sympathetic to the Palestinian cause. So, and the polls, of course, are showing that the liberals are in real trouble. And if they were to fall today, their government were to fall today, they almost certainly would lose in an election with Poilievre because they're trailing the conservatives so heavily. So this means that the NDP has a lot of leverage over the liberals. It has a tremendous amount of leverage, and it has a tremendous amount of support for Palestinians at the grassroots level. So you would think that in the current circumstances, particularly given the absolute diabolical, sadistic, monstrous behavior of Israel, which couldn't possibly be worse, in my opinion. I can't imagine something worse than what Israel is doing today to Gaza. This is the bottom of the barrel, the most evil thing that anybody can do to an oppressed population, a trapped and oppressed population. They're literally just obliterating them, sadistically targeting children, mass murdered over 16,000 of them, has basically destroyed the civilian infrastructure of 80% of Gaza, is in the process of completing the destruction of what remains, is starving the population, and they actually take videos, these psychopaths, and post videos of themselves on social media committing war crimes.
Yeah.
Okay?
They boast about it.
Yes. They're bragging about it, and the leaders of Israel have been openly genocidal in their rhetoric. This is probably the most remarkable thing about this whole thing, is how the parties that are perpetrating the genocide are so open about what they're doing and so willing to share with us evidence of their crimes. And despite all of that, and despite the favorable political conditions that exist in Canada, in theory, for a pro-Palestinian change in policy, the policies have not changed one iota. And I should add, despite also the fact, in my lifetime, I'm 60 years old now, and I've spent most of my life in Canada, I have never seen anything cause so much protest in Canada as this, ever. I mean, maybe, I don't know, the Vietnam War, I don't know. I was a little boy at the time, so I was too young to participate, but even then, I don't remember seeing anything like this. I mean, just in Montreal, I was there for 6 weeks during the genocide. The rest of the time, I've been in West Asia and Greece. But I've been watching very closely. And when I was there in Montreal, I mean, there were multiple protests every week. I went to at least two to three protests a week. This has been continuing for 7 months. I've never seen anything like it. And yet the Canadian government, a liberal minority government, propped up by the NDP, has not done a single thing to support the Palestinian people that is meaningful. Not a single thing. Yeah, sure, they imposed sanctions on 4 settlers out of the 700,000 settlers. And the government of Canada did that only after the United States did it and the Brits did it. Yeah. But that obviously is not going to change anything. It's not meaningful. These people, 4 people out of 700,000 settlers, none of them is in a minister in the Israeli government or is in a leadership position in the Israeli military, and these people in Ottawa think that we're stupid enough to believe this is going to change anything. It's not going to change anything. And not only that, and this for me was a real shock. You know, even somebody like me who has such a negative opinion about the Canadian government already, I was shocked when within hours of the International Court of Justice ruling that Israel was plausibly committing genocide, that the psychopaths in Ottawa withdrew funding for the United Nations Relief Works Agency. And nobody should have any illusions about what happened there. Okay, this was not a decision that the Canadian government made, you know, in the few hours that passed between the decision of the ICJ and the announcement of the decision. Decisions like that are not made in a few hours. There's a lot of internal debate within the government. They think about the political consequences of this. Well, how are their allies going to react, and blah, blah, blah. At a bare minimum, the Canadian government made that decision over a period of days and probably weeks. But it waited until 3 or 4 hours after the ICJ announced its decision to announce that it was making this decision. And it did it on the basis of no credible evidence. We now know that there was no credible evidence that anybody at UNRWA, and this was the allegation, participated in the October 7 attacks. Even if the allegation had been true, that a few employees, lower level of employees, participated in the October 7 attacks, there would have been absolutely no justification to withdraw funding to the entire, you know, humanitarian organization. But nonetheless, there wasn't any evidence. So what was the message? Why did the government do this? People need to ask themselves this question. Why would the government make a decision in advance, which it almost certainly did, and announce the decision to do this depraved thing within hours of the ICJ's decision? I believe, I can't prove it, but the only thing my mind can come up with to make sense of this is that the United States government and its allies in the West, including Canada, wanted to send a message to the world. And the message to the world was, if you try to hold Israel accountable for what it's doing, we are going to cause the Palestinian people to suffer even more. I know that sounds extreme, but that's my interpretation of their behavior. Whatever their motivation was for doing it, it is absolutely shocking that they did it. Even if my explanation of their behavior is incorrect, nobody can plausibly argue that this was not absolutely depraved what they did. So I have come to the conclusion, Wissam, sorry for the long-winded speech, but I have to get this off my chest. I've come to the conclusion that the Canadian government is as bad as anything you could possibly imagine. I mean, I really can't think of anything worse. And now people might say, you know, in trying to sort of reconcile their views, their soft and cuddly views about the Canadian government with what I've just said, they might say, well, you know, in Canada, they don't do this sort of thing. They're not blowing people up in the streets. They're not torturing people. I personally, however, do not draw a moral distinction between what the government does at home and what it facilitates abroad. Because for me, Palestinian lives matter every bit as much as the lives of non-Palestinians. So the fact that they aren't, you know, they aren't dropping, you know, 2,000-pound bunker buster bombs on low-income neighborhoods in Toronto, but they're helping the Israelis to do it. They're providing weapons to the Israelis, or they're buying weapons from the Israelis, and they're giving, you know, preferential tariff treatment to goods produced in Israel's illegal settlements, and they're giving charitable treatment to organizations in Canada, that are supporting this genocidal regime and whitewashing the genocide. For me, there's no distinction. There's no distinction between Canada helping Israel to commit these monstrosities and Canada committing these acts in Canada. Because Palestinian lives matter just as much as the lives of people living in Canada. Now, maybe people don't agree with that reasoning, but that's how I see it. And so for me, the Canadian government is bottom of the barrel, people of the lowest moral caliber, monsters, really. They're monsters. That's how I now see them. I wouldn't have said that before. Yeah, now I see them as monsters.
I agree. As a Palestinian, and what's interesting, you mentioned the UNRWA funding. I don't think Canada has stopped any funding to any UN agency, as far as I know. They did UNRWA before. I know that they've done it during Harper. But and with the UNRWA case specifically, these are allegations there were other UN agencies that had proof of corruption. There was the case in Africa with the sexual violence that was done. They didn't stop or halt or pause or investigate. It was another day in the neighborhood, right? It just kept on going. But with this one single allegation, stop funding. I mean, that's
it during the genocide.
I know,
during the genocide.
During a genocide, yeah. And I mean, the scorecard is terrible, right? The ICC was part of it. Their position on that was terrible. Mark Miller's policy towards Gazan, refugees. Until now, 8 months later, 0 people came. The whole thing was a mess. It was. I mean, I couldn't find words to describe it. It was flat out racist. I mean, it was. I wanted to ask about. If you look at the period since October 7 and you go party by party, do you think there's any one party that has been a bit more active, a bit more vocal, has done anything that would help in any way, either curbing the genocide or assisting the Palestinian?
Well, if we're looking at rhetoric, sure, the NDP and the Greens, they talk a good game. I guess, but when it comes to actually carrying out actions that it really doing things that are meaningful, that are actually meaningful to support the Palestinian people, no, I don't see any difference between them and the liberals and frankly the conservatives. In a way, the conservatives are less disgusting than the other political parties in parliament because the conservatives are more open about the fact that they are supporting the genocide. They're not pretending. They're not pretending to care about the Palestinian people. It's like, we don't give a damn about those people. Well, we have to deal with this nonsense coming through the other parties that they actually care when, in fact, their policies prove that they don't. And there's one thing I want to say, two things I want to say about the NDP and one thing I want to say about the Greens, which I think really highlight how they too are fraudulent at the end of the day when it comes to not just the Palestinian cause, when it comes to the whole question of Western hegemony, the rules-based international order and all that crap, okay? The NDP has the power to bring down the government. It has the power to bring down the government. As I explained, it has more leverage now than it probably will ever have because the liberals would lose if there had to be an election. So they've got the liberals over a fire. Why haven't they brought down the government? I would have thought that supporting a genocide is about as good a reason as you could possibly have to bring down a damn government. And they haven't even threatened to do that, as far as I know. There hasn't even been serious discussion about this at the leadership level or, in NDP policy circles. There's just, no apparent interest whatsoever in doing this. And people may say, well, then if they did that, then the conservatives would come to power. I would go back to what I just said. Well, we would still have genocide supporters in power, but at least they would be more honest about their psychopathic behavior. Whereas we have to deal with this kabuki theater that's coming out of Ottawa every day. When we constantly hear Melanie Joly go, I have deep concern and I'm very troubled about this and I'm very troubled about that. And here, by the way, let's buy $40 million of your missiles and here's $36 million of weapons, but I'm very concerned about your behavior. I'd rather have openly genocidal people in power than these frauds who are actually genocidal but pretending to be humanitarian. But so this is one thing I want to say about the NDP. The NDP has the power to bring down the government. It has the best possible reason to do so. And it hasn't even openly talked about that possibility. So this, to me, alone proves that they're frauds. But there's something that applies to both the Greens and the NDP, which I think really proves that they're frauds. And that is this, and people may disagree with me about this, but for 2.5 years, I've been criticizing the Canadian government's support of this proxy war in Ukraine. Okay, I think that we have been lied to about the reason for sending all of these weapons to Ukraine. I don't think it has anything to do with international law or human rights. I think it was all about weakening Russia because Russia was viewed as a geopolitical rival. If the Americans cared about human rights and international law, would they be supporting Israel? I mean, come on, give me a break. That war has nothing to do with international law and human rights. It has to do with not only weakening a geopolitical rival, but enriching the U.S. military-industrial complex. And so I've been very critical about this war for those and other reasons. And I've been saying we shouldn't be sending weapons over there. We have better things to do with our money. We should be supporting our healthcare system. We should be helping the homeless. We should be helping people like the Palestinians who are being brutally oppressed by our ally. Okay, so what did the Greens and the NDP do when, over the last 2.5 years in relation to the war in Ukraine, which has killed hundreds of thousands of people, in which Ukraine, as many of us predicted, is losing? It's destroying the country. Ultimately, that's going to be the outcome of this war. It will destroy Ukraine. And the very people that we claim to want to help are going to be devastated for life. But what did the NDP and the Greens do? They said, oh, we should send them weapons. They were on board with this. Air defense systems, missiles, tanks, armored personnel carriers, blah, blah, blah. Has anybody in the NDP or Greens said a word about sending weapons to the Palestinians? Not only have they not advocated for sending weapons to the Palestinians, they've been sending weapons to Israel and buying weapons from Israel, or at least not getting in the way of that being done. The NDP could have brought down the government over the issue. But in addition, they won't even raise the possibility that maybe we should be helping the Palestinians to defend themselves from this genocide. Not a word about that. But they were perfectly prepared to advocate vigorously for sending all kinds of weapons to Ukraine. Now, I don't know how to view that other than as racism. What, only the Ukrainians have a right to defend themselves? And nobody, by the way, no international tribunal has come to the conclusion that it's plausible that Russia is committing genocide in Ukraine. That hasn't happened. Maybe it will one day, but it hasn't happened thus far. There has been a judgment by the International Court of Justice, as I mentioned, that it's plausible that Israel is committing genocide. And even still, the Greens and the NDP won't even whisper that maybe we should be helping the Palestinians to put up armed resistance to their destruction. Not a word. So for me, this is racism. It's utter hypocrisy. And I frankly would throw the NDP and the Greens in the same, garbage bin as the Liberals and the Conservatives. I see no reason to view them any differently. I think they're just a bunch of windbags.
I agree.
I
can't.